Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 534, Uno Mas. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am at the end of the last week of heck. It's been crazy. I had to miss Tuesday morning and I had to miss Thursday night again, and I miss you guys so much. But I was talking to one of the other contact tracers late last night, and I made a comparison that made her heart swell. And if you have taught at all, or at least more than 2 years, you will understand this as well. My parallel that I drew was that next Monday is the beginning of our 3rd year. It seems that the first 2 years of teaching are, especially if you're able to teach the same courses, the first 2 years are very hard. There's a whole lot of overwhelming everythingness to the job. It all hits you at once. Classroom management and curriculum management, and you have to read everything all over again because even if you read it in graduate school, it doesn't matter. You have to do it a different way because now you actually see how you have to teach. So there's a whole lot that happens in those first 2 years. The 3rd year, though, all of a sudden, it's like a different job. You know what you're doing. You know who's doing what. You know how to wing it if you have to. There's a million different things that start to go right. And we have definitely been in a trial by fire with some awesome people. It's no one's fault. It's just big and unwieldy and a lot of moving parts. And the people in charge have been likening it to a startup company. And it very much is. That said, because we are really a team of lovely, hardworking teachers and trainers, I am absolutely banking on the fact that next week is going to be like, yeah, been there, done that. We know how this rolls out. We know where the sticky points are going to be. We know where we're going to have to do a little bit different. And that is everything you need, because no longer are you writing for the first time and doing for the first time. You are now familiar with all of it. Because of that, I am banking that this is the last time I have to just dump a chapter on you and run. So, uno más y nada. This is it. Please, 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 please. Next Tuesday, I want to get on a call at 5 a.m. and see my friends' faces. And ditto on Thursday night. And Tracy in Atlanta, you are a mensch. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't wait to see you again. Okay. The guests are still at Grassdale. Helen is still putting up with people. And this chapter is one that I had written on the top back in, I think, January, February, when I was going through this for the second time on paper this time, though, not listening. I had written at the top of the chapter, wow, Aunt Irony. So this is the chapter where we hear Helen really grow up. She has a reason to sort of recognize the irony of the situation that she's in at the beginning of the chapter and almost kind of comment on it, but mostly it's our benefit because now she becomes her aunt. She has someone who she is trying to Helen, and it's sad, it's bittersweet, it's honest, and it's the problem anyone who's worked with young people knows. It's really hard to help them learn from your mistakes. So we get to watch a bit of that, and then we get to see someone other than Arthur doing what he does as he does. And it's a fairly enlightening conversation that happens after that. So as you're listening, I'm very, very curious to know if you have come across someone who feels the way that, in this case, Hattersley does, and Hattersley, just to remind you, because there's so many H's, is married to Millicent Hargrave, who we like. All right, I'm going to launch you into this and pick you up on the backside, and I'm interested to hear what you have to think about what Hattersley has to say. Here we go. Chapter 32 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, read for us by Maya DeGear.
Chapter 32. Comparisons. Information rejected. October 5th. Esther Hargrave is getting a fine girl. She's not out of the schoolroom yet, but her mother frequently brings her over to call in the mornings when the gentlemen are out, and sometimes she spends an hour or two in company with her sister and me and the children. And when we go to the Grove, I always contrive to see her, and talk more to her than to anyone else, for I'm very much attached to my little friend, and so is she to me. I wonder what she can see to like in me, though, for I'm no longer the happy, lively girl I used to be. But she has no other society, save that of her uncongenial mother and governess, as artificial and conventional a person as that prudent mother could produce to rectify the pupil's natural qualities. And now and then her subdued, quiet sister. I often wonder what would be her lot in life, and so does she, but her speculations for the future are full of buoyant hope. So were mine once. I shudder to think of her being awakened like me to a sense of their delusive vanity. It seems as if I should feel her disappointment even more deeply than my own. I feel almost as if I was born for such a fate, but she is so joyous and fresh, so light of heart and free of spirit, and so guileless and unsuspecting too. Oh, it would be cruel to make her feel as I feel now, and know what I have known. Her sister trembles for her too. Yesterday morning, one of October's brightest, loveliest days, Millicent and I were in the garden enjoying a brief half-hour together with our children, while Annabella was lying on the drawing-room sofa deep in the last new novel. We had been romping with the little creatures, almost as merry and wild as themselves, and now paused in the shade of a tall copper beech to recover breath and rectify our hair, disordered by the rough play and the frolicsome breeze, while they toddled together along the broad sunny walk, my Arthur supporting the feebler steps of her little Helen, and sagaciously pointing out to her the brightest beauties of the border as they passed, with semi-articulate prattle that did as well for her as any other mode of discourse. From laughing at the pretty sight, we began to talk of the children's future life that made us thoughtful. We both relapsed into silent musings as we slowly proceeded up the walk, and I suppose Millicent, by a train of associations, was led to think of her sister. "Helen," she said, "you often see Esther, don't you?" "Not very often." "But you have more frequent opportunities of meeting her than I have. She loves you, I know, and reverences you too. There is nobody's opinion she thinks so much of, and she says you have more sense than mamma." "That is because she is self-willed, and my opinions more generally coincide with her own than your mamma's. But what then, Millicent?" "Well, since you have so much influence with her, I wish you would seriously impress upon her, never on any account or for anybody's persuasion, to marry for the sake of money or rank or establishment, or any earthly thing but true affection and well-grounded esteem." "There is no necessity for that," said I, "for we have had some discourse on the subject already, and I assure you her ideas of love and matrimony are as romantic as anyone could desire." "But romantic notions will not do. I want her to have true notions." "Very right. But in my judgment, what the world stigmatizes as romantic is often more nearly allied to the truth than is commonly supposed. For if the generous ideas of youth are too often overclouded by the sordid views of afterlife, that scarcely proves them to be false." "Well, but if you think her ideas are what they ought to be, strengthen them, will you? And confirm them as far as you can. For I had romantic notions once, and I don't mean to say I regret my lot, for I'm quite sure I don't, but—" "I understand you," said I. "You are contented for yourself, but you would not have your sister to suffer the same as you?" "No. Or worse. She might have far worse to suffer than I, for I am really contented, Helen, though you mayn't think it. I speak the solemn truth in saying that I would not exchange my husband for any man on earth if I might do it by the plucking of this leaf. Well, I believe you. Now that you have him, you would not exchange him for another, but then you would gladly exchange some of his qualities for those of a better man. Yes, just as I would gladly exchange some of my own qualities for those of a better woman, for neither he nor I are perfect, and I desire his improvement as earnestly as my own. And he will improve, don't you think so, Helen? He's only 26 yet. He may, I answered. He will, repeated she. Excuse the faintness of my acquiescence, Millicent. I would not discourage your hopes for the world, but mine have been so often disappointed that I am become as cold and doubtful in my expectations as the flattest of octogenarians. And yet you do hope still, even for Mr. Huntington? I do confess, even for him, for it seems as if life and hope must cease together. And is he so much worse, Millicent, than Mr. Hattersley? Well, to give you my candid opinion, I think there's no comparison between them. But you mustn't be offended, Helen, for you know I always speak my mind, and you may speak yours too, I shan't care. I'm not offended, love, and my opinion is that if there be a comparison made between the two, the difference, for the most part, is certainly in Hattersley's favour. Millicent's own heart told her how much it cost me to make this acknowledgment, and with the childlike impulse, she expressed her sympathy by suddenly kissing my cheek without a word of reply, and then turning quickly away, caught up her baby and hid her face in its frock. How odd it is that we so often weep for each other's distresses, when we shed not a tear for our own. Her heart had been full enough of her own sorrows, but it overflowed at the idea of mine, and I too shed tears at the sight of her sympathetic emotion, though I had not wept for myself for many a week. But Millicent's satisfaction in her choice is not entirely feigned. She really loves her husband, and it is too true that he loses nothing by comparison with mine. Either he is less unbridled in his excess, or owing to his stronger, hardier frame, they produce a much less deleterious effect upon him, for he never reduces himself to a state in any degree bordering on imbecility, and with him the worst effect of a night's debauch is a slight increase of irascibility, or it may be a season of sullen ferocity on the following morning. There's nothing of that lost, depressing appearance, that peevish, ignoble fretfulness that wears one out with the very shame for the transgressor. But then it was not formerly so with Arthur. He can bear less now than he could at Hattersley's age, and if the latter does not reform his powers of endurance, may be equally impaired when he has tried them as long. He has 5 years the advantage of his friend, and his vices have not mastered him yet. He has not folded them to him and made them part of himself. They seem to sit loose upon him, like a cloak that he could throw aside at any moment if he would. But how long will that option be left him? Though a creature of passion and sense, regardless of the duties of the higher privileges of intelligent beings, he is no voluptuary. He prefers the more active, invigorating animal enjoyments to those of a more relaxing, enervating kind. He does not make a science of the gratification of his appetites either, in the pleasures of the table or anything else. He eats heartily what is set before him, without demeaning himself by any of that abandonment to the palate and the eye, that unbecoming particularity in approval or disapproval which it is so hateful to witness in those we would esteem. Arthur, I fear, would give himself up to luxury as the chief good, and might ultimately plunge into the grossest excesses, but for the fear of irremediable blunting his appetites and destroying his powers of further enjoyment. For Hattersley, graceless ruffian as he is, I believe there's more reasonable ground of hope, and far be it from me to blame poor Millicent for his delinquencies, but I do think that if she had the courage or the will to speak her mind about them and maintain her point unflinchingly, there would be more chance of his reclamation, and he would be more likely to treat her better and love her more in the end. I'm partly led to think so by what he said to me himself not many days ago. I purpose to give her a little advice on the subject sometime, but still I hesitate, from the consciousness that her ideas and disposition are both against it, and if my counsels fail to do good, they would do harm by making her more unhappy. It was one rainy day last week. Most of the company were killing time in the billiard room, but Millicent and I were with little Arthur and Helen in the library, and between our books, our children, and each other, we expected to make out a very agreeable morning. We had not been thus secluded above 2 hours, however, when Mr. Hattersley came in, attracted, I suppose, by the voice of his child as he was crossing the hall, for he is prodigiously fond of her, and she of him. He was redolent of the stables, where he had been regaling himself with the company of his fellow creatures, the horses, ever since breakfast, but that was no matter to my little namesake. As soon as the colossal person of her father darkened the door, she uttered a thrill scream of delight, and quitting her mother's side, ran crowing towards him, balancing her course with outstretched arms, and embracing his knee, threw back her head and laughed in his face. He might well look smilingly down upon those small fair features, radiant with innocent mirth, those clear blue shining eyes, and that soft flaxen hair cast back upon a little ivory neck and shoulders. Did he not think how unworthy he was of such a possession? I fear no such idea crossed his mind. He caught her up, and there followed some minutes of very rough play, during which it's difficult to say whether the father or the daughter laughed and shouted the loudest. At length, however, the boisterous pastime terminated, suddenly as might be expected. The little one was hurt and began to cry, and its ungentle playfellow tossed it into its mother's lap, bidding her make all straight. As happy to return to that gentle comforter as it had been to leave her, the child nestled in her arms and hushed its cries in a moment, and sinking its little weary head upon her bosom, soon dropped asleep. Meantime, Mr. Hattersley strode up to the fire, and interposing his height and breadth between us and it, stood with arms akimbo, expanding his chest and gazing around him, as if the house and all its appurtenances and contents were his own undisputed possessions. "Deuced bad weather, this," he began. "There'll be no shooting to-day, I guess." Then, suddenly lifting up his voice, he regaled us with a few bars of a rollicking song, which, abruptly ceasing, he finished the tune with a whistle, and then continued, "I say, Mrs. Huntington, what fine stud your husband has. Not large, but good. I've been looking at them a bit this morning, but upon my word, Black Bess and Grey Tom, and that young Nimrod are the finest animals I've seen for many a day." There followed a particular discussion of their various merits, succeeded by a sketch of the great things he intended to do in the horse-jockey line, when his old governor thought proper to quit the stage. "Not that I wish him to close his accounts," added he. "The old Trojan is welcome to keep his books open as long as he pleases for me." "I hope so indeed, Mr. Hattersley." "Oh, yes, it's only my way of talking. The event must come some time, and so I must look to the bright side of it. That's the right plan, isn't it, Mrs. H? What are you two doing here, by the by? Where's Lady Lowborough?" "In the billiard room." "What a splendid creature she is," continued he, fixing his eyes on his wife, who changed colour and looked more and more disconcerted as he proceeded. "What a noble figure she has! What a magnificent black eyes, and what a fine spirit of her own, and what a tongue of her own, too, when she likes to use it. I perfectly adore her. But never mind, Millicent, I wouldn't have her for my wife, not if she'd a kingdom for a dowry. I'm better satisfied with the one I have. Now then, why do you look so sulky for? Don't you believe me?" "Yes, I believe you," murmured she in a tone of half sad, half sullen resignation, as she turned away to stroke the hair of her sleeping infant, that she had laid on the sofa beside her. "Well then, what makes you so cross? Come here, Milly, and tell me why you can't be satisfied with my assurance." She went, and putting her little hand within his arm, looked up in his face and said softly, "What does it amount to, Ralph? Only to this, that though you admire Annabella so much for qualities that I don't possess, you would still rather have me than her for your wife, which merely proves that you don't think it necessary to love your wife. You're satisfied if she can keep your house and take care of your child. But I'm not cross. I'm only sorry for," added she in a low tremulous accent, withdrawing her hand from his arm, and bending her looks on the rug. "If you don't love me, you don't, and it can't be helped." Very true, but who told you I didn't? Did I say I loved Annabella? You said you adored her. True, but adoration isn't love. I adore Annabella, but I don't love her. I love thee, Millicent, but I don't adore thee. In proof of his affection, he clutched a handful of her light brown ringlets and appeared to twist them unmercifully. Do you really, Ralph? Murmured she, with a faint smile beaming through her tears, just putting her hand up to his in token that he pulled rather too hard. To be sure I do, responded he. Only you bother me rather sometimes. I bother you? Cried she in very natural surprise. Yes, you, but only by your exceeding goodness. When a boy has been cramming raisins and sugar plums all day, he longs for a squeeze of sour orange by way of change. And did you never, Milly, observe the sands on the seashore, how nice and smooth they look, and how soft and easy they feel to the foot? But if you plod along for half an hour over this soft, easy carpet, giving way at every step, yielding the more the harder you press, you find it rather wearisome work, and be glad enough to come to a bit of good firm rock that won't budge an inch when you stand, walk, or stamp upon it. And though it be hard as nether millstone, you find it the easier footing after all. I know what you mean, Ralph, she said, nervously playing with her watch guard and tracing the figure on the rug with the point of her tiny foot. I know what you mean, but I thought you always liked to be yielded to, and I can't alter now. I do like it, replied he, bringing her to him by another tug at her hair. You mustn't mind my talk, Milly. A man must have something to grumble about, and if he can't complain that his wife harries him to death with her perversity and ill humour, he must complain that she wears him out with her kindness and gentleness. But why complain at all, unless because you are tired and dissatisfied? To excuse my own failings, to be sure. Do you think I'll bear all the burden of my sins on my own shoulders, as long as there's another ready to help me with none of her own to carry? There is no such one on earth, she said seriously, and then, taking his hand from her head, she kissed it with an air of genuine devotion and tripped away to the door. What now? Said he. Where are you going? To tidy my hair, she answered, smiling through her disordered locks. You've made it all come down. Off with you, then. An excellent little woman, he remarked when she was gone, but a thought too soft. She almost melts in one's hands. I positively think I ill-use her sometimes when I've taken too much. But I can't help it, for she never complains, either at the time or after. I suppose she doesn't mind it. I can enlighten you on that subject, Mr. Hattersley, I said. She does mind it, and some other things she minds still more, which yet you may never hear her complain of. How do you know? Does she complain to you? Demanded he, with a sudden spark of fury, ready to burst into a flame if I should answer yes. No, I replied, but I've known her longer and studied her more closely than you have done, and I can tell you, Mr. Hattersley, that Millicent loves you more than you deserve, and that you have it in your power to make her very happy, instead of which you are her evil genius, and I will venture to say there's not a single day passes in which you do not inflict upon her some pang that you might spare her of if you would. Well, it's not my fault, said he, gazing carelessly up at the ceiling and plunging his hands into his pockets. If my ongoings don't suit her, she should tell me so. Is she not exactly the wife you wanted? Did he not tell Mr. Huntington that you must have one that would submit to anything without a murmur, and never blame you whatever you did? True, but we shouldn't always have what we want. It spoils the best of us, doesn't it? How can I help playing the deuce when I see it's all one to her whether I behave like a Christian or a scoundrel, such as nature made me? How can I help teasing her when she's so invitingly meek and mim? When she lies down like a spaniel at my feet and never so much as squeaks to tell me that's enough? If you're a tyrant by nature, the temptation is strong, I'll allow. But no generous mind delights to oppress the weak, but rather to cherish and protect. I don't oppress her, but it's so confoundedly flat to be always cherishing and protecting. And then how can I tell that I am oppressing her when she melts away and makes no sign? I sometimes think she has no feeling at all, and then I go on till she cries, and that satisfies me. Then you do delight to oppress her? I don't, I tell you. Only when I'm in a bad humour, or a particularly good one, and want to afflict the pleasure of comforting, or when she looks flat and wants shaking up a bit. And sometimes she provokes me by crying for nothing and won't tell me what it's for, and then I allow it enrages me past bearing, especially when I'm not my own man. As is generally no doubt the case on such occasions, said I. But in future, Mr. Hattersley, when you see her looking flat or crying for nothing, as you call it, ascribe it all to yourself. Be assured it is something you have done amiss, or your general misconduct, that distresses her. I don't believe it. If it were, she should tell me so. I don't like that way of moping and fretting in silence and saying nothing. It's not honest. How can she expect me to mend my ways at that rate? Perhaps she gives you credit for having more sense than you possess, and deludes herself with the hope that you will one day see your own errors and repair them, if left to your own reflection. None of your sneers, Mrs. Huntington. I have the sense to see I'm not always quite correct, but sometimes I think it's no great matter as long as I injure no one but myself. It is a great matter, interrupted I, both to yourself, as you will hereafter find to your cost, and to all concerned with you, most especially your wife. But indeed it's nonsense to talk about injuring no one but yourself. It's impossible to injure yourself, especially by such acts as we allude to, without injuring hundreds, if not thousands, besides, in a greater or lesser degree, either by the evil you do or the good you leave undone. As I was saying, continued he, or I would have said if you hadn't taken me up so short, I sometimes think I should do better if I were joined to one that would always remind me when I was wrong and give me a motive for doing good and eschewing evil by decidedly showing her approval of the one and disapproval of the other. If you had no higher motive than approval of your fellow mortal, it would do you little good. Well, but if I had a mate that would not always be yielding and always equally kind, but that would have the spirit to stand at bay now and then, and honestly tell me her mind at all times, such as one as yourself, for instance. Now, if I went on with you as I do with her when in London, you'd make the house too hot to hold me at times, I'd be sworn. You mistake me. I'm no termagant. Well, all the better for that, for I can't stand contradiction in a general way, and I'm as fond of my own will as another. Only I think too much of it if it doesn't answer for any man. Well, I would never contradict you without a cause, but certainly I would always let you know what I thought of your conduct, and if you oppress me in body, mind, or estate, you should at least have no reason to suppose I didn't mind it. I know that, my lady, and I think if my little wife were to follow the same plan, it would be better for us both. I'll tell her. No, no, let her be. There's much to be said on both sides. And now I think upon it, Huntington often regrets that you are not more like her, scoundrelly dog that he is. And you see, after all, you can't reform him. He's 10 times worse than I. He's afraid of you, to be sure. That is, he's always on his best behaviour in your presence, but I wonder what his worst behaviour is like then, I could not forbear observing. Why, to tell you the truth, it's very bad indeed. Isn't it, Hargrave? Said he, addressing that gentleman, who had entered the room unperceived by me, for I was now standing near the fire with my back to the door. Isn't Huntington, he continued, as great a reprobate as ever was damned? His lady will not hear him censured with impunity, replied Mr. Hargrave, coming forward, but I must say I thank God I am not such another. Perhaps it would become you better, said I, to look at what you are and say, God be merciful to me, a sinner. You are severe, returned he, bowing slightly and drawing himself up with a proud yet injured air. Mr. Hattersley laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. Moving from under his hand with a gesture of insulted dignity, Mr. Hargrave took himself away to the other end of the rug. Isn't it a shame, Mrs. Huntington? Cried his brother-in-law. I struck Walter Hargrave when I was drunk, the second night after we came, and he's turned a cold shoulder on me ever since, though I asked his pardon the very morning after it was done. Your manner of asking it, returned the other, and the clearness with which you remember the whole transaction showed you were not too drunk to be fully conscious of what you were about, and quite responsible for the deed. You wanted to interfere between me and my wife, grumbled Hattersley, and that's enough to provoke any man. You justify it, then, said his opponent, darting upon him a most vindictive glance. No, I tell you I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't been under excitement, and if you chose to bear malice for it after the handsome things I've said, do so and be damned. I would refrain from such a language in a lady's presence at least, said Mr. Hargrave, hiding his anger under a mask of disgust. What have I said? Returned Hattersley. Nothing but heaven's truth. He will be damned, won't he, Mrs. Huntington, if he does not forgive his brother's trespass? You ought to forgive him, Mr. Hargrave, since he asks you, said I. Do you say so? Then I will. And smiling almost frankly, he stepped forward and offered his hand. It was immediately clasped in that of his relative, and the reconciliation was apparently cordial on both sides. The affront, continued Hargrave, turning to me, owed half its bitterness to the fact of its being offered in your presence, and since you bid me forgive it, I will, and forget it too. I guess the best return I can make will be to take myself off, muttered Hattersley with a broad grin. His companion smiled, and he left the room. This put me on my guard. Mr. Hargrave turned seriously to me and earnestly began. Dear Mrs. Huntington, how I have longed for yet dreaded this hour. Do not be alarmed, he added, for my face was crimson with anger. I am not about to offend you with any useless entreaties or complaints. I am not going to presume to trouble you with the mention of my own feelings or your perfections. But I have something to reveal to you which you ought to know, and which yet it pains me inexpressibly. Then don't trouble yourself to reveal it. But it is of importance. If so, I shall hear it soon enough, especially if it is bad news, as you seem to consider it. At present I am going to take the children to the nursery. But can't you ring and send them? No, I want the exercise of a room to the top of the house. Come, Arthur. But you will return? Not yet. Don't wait. Then when may I see you again? At lunch, said I, departing with little Helen in one arm and leading Arthur by the hand. He turned away, muttering some sentence of impatient censure or complaint, in which heartless was the only distinguishable word. What nonsense is this, Mr. Hargrave? Said I, pausing in the doorway. What do you mean? Oh, nothing. I did not intend you should hear my soliloquy. But the fact is, Mrs. Huntington, I have a disclosure to make, painful for me to offer as for you to hear, and I want you to give me a few minutes of your attention in private, at a time and place you like to appoint. It is from no selfish motive that I ask it, and not for any cause that could alarm your superhuman purity. Therefore you need not kill me with that look of cold and pitiless disdain. I know too well the feelings with which the bearers of bad tidings are commonly regarded, not to— What is this wonderful piece of intelligence? Said I impatiently, interrupting him. If it is anything of real importance, speak it in 3 words before I go. In 3 words I cannot. Send those children away and stay with me. No, keep your bad tidings to yourself. I know it is something I don't want to hear, and something you would displease me by telling. You have divined too truly, I fear. But still, since I know it, I feel it my duty to disclose it to you. Oh, spare us both the infliction, and I will exonerate you from the duty. You have offered to tell, I have refused to hear. My ignorance will not be charged on you. Be it so. You shall not hear it from me. But if the blow falls suddenly upon you when it comes, remember I wish to soften it. I left him. I was determined his words should not alarm me. What could he, of all men, have to reveal that was of importance for me to hear? It was no doubt some exaggerated tale about my unfortunate husband that he wished to make the most of to serve his own bad purposes. 6th. He has not alluded to this momentous mystery since, and I have seen no reason to repent of my unwillingness to hear it. The threatened blow has not been struck yet, and I do not greatly fear it. At present I am pleased with Arthur. He has not positively disgraced himself for upwards of a fortnight, and all this last week has been so very moderate in his indulgence at table that I can perceive a marked difference in his general temper and appearance. Dare I hope this will continue?
Right. So, Arthur's been behaving himself. Surely, this can't be true. At the end of the previous chapter, we learned that Arabella had been behaving herself and that Helen judged her better behavior from the moment when Arthur stopped really paying attention to her, and she chilled out and started to treat Lord Loughborough a little bit better. And now we have in this chapter Arthur completely absent, but only because this was a prolonged scene between Hattersley and eventually Hargrave, Millicent's brother, and Helen. I thought Helen showed extraordinary fortitude at the end of this chapter in that she didn't want to hear. She didn't want to know. I would so not be her at that point. So I give her mad props for that. That said, she certainly stuck to it with Hattersley. I almost choked. I remember the first time I was listening to this when Hattersley said that Millicent wasn't bothered by his bad behavior. I remember kind of choking and thinking, oh, Helen, keep your mouth shut. This is not going to end well. But it actually did. They had a real conversation. Hattersley didn't respond the way Arthur would have necessarily. I was also fairly surprised that they were having this conversation in front of children, because later on in the chapter, we find out that Helen is about to take the children up to the nursery, which surprised me. But I suppose at the same time, it's not like anything that they said in front of them was so scandalous or shocking. It's just nothing that they wouldn't have seen. And they're still pretty little, so I guess it's not that big a surprise. But I thought that Hattersley's, wow, Anne Bronte, I wish you could have replaced some of these names before you published. Hattersley, his justifications for his behavior, it's not that they were so surprising or shocking or even so pathetic as they struck me being very, very young. And we do find out in this that he's 26. Most of the others seem to be older than him. But 26, married with a kid, I know back then was not so shockingly old or young. That was probably pretty average for guys. But wow, man-childiness. But also, and I think this is one of the things that Bronte was getting at, there are so few checks on men's behavior in society at the time. And his expectation that his wife would be the check on his behavior. And you can hear it in his voice that were Millicent to, quote unquote, and I'm using air quotes now, nag at him about his behavior, he would be not so happy to hear any of that, but at the same time seems to recognize that he needs to have a check on himself. And we saw this kind of mirrored earlier in Arthur when he was wooing Helen. This, oh, you'd be my better angel. Oh, you'd be the one there to tell me when I was straying from the path. There's a whole lot of emphasis, and it's not the Madonna whore dichotomy that we often see. I think it's kind of more complicated than that. It's the, I want to love you. I want you to be, beautiful and fun and all of those things. But I also need a pole star. I need something by which I can measure my behavior, which goes back to a scene that we have talked about probably thousands of times because it's one of those scenes for me. But now it is also one of those scenes for my kids. And it's the scene in To Kill a Mockingbird where the mob has come to the jail to lynch Tom Robinson, and the kids show up because they think Atticus needs them. And in the middle of the mob, Scout sees somebody that she knows and does her, if you've watched the movie, hey, Mr. Cunningham. And suddenly the mob starts to get kind of uncomfortable and shift around a little bit. And Mr. Cunningham has a conversation with her, and suddenly it's not a mob anymore, it's a guy. It appears that this group of guys are far worse behaved when they are amongst each other. And yet, like any addiction, they can't quit each other. They just can't stop hanging out together. And they feel like all heck in the morning when they're coming off of a night of drunken and whatever debauchery, but they just can't, like any addict, they can't stop. But the fact that they keep talking about the need for a better angel, the need for guidance, makes it pretty clear that they know they should. So it brings up the question that I pose to you now. How do we deal with mobs, with groupthink, especially destructive or self-destructive or both groupthink. It is a question that's been on our minds for a while now, and it's complicated and important. And I know I've talked about the book The True Believer before. It was written, I believe, in the 50s, and it's The True Believer on the Nature of Mass Movements. And if you do sit down to read it, and I really do recommend that you do, you can get it as an ebook off of several different websites. There is no audiobook version currently, and I reread it recently. I think it's probably because the language that the author uses in the book is fairly matter-of-factly clinical in many ways, and that definitely comes across as insensitive nowadays. But as we've seen with so many books that we've read here or essays that we've talked about before, certainly it's kind of unfair to expect people to have been better than they could have been at the time with what was surrounding them at the time as well. So you do kind of have to read it with your historical glasses on rather than modern ones. That said, his analysis of how mass movements start and grow and fester is not something we should be ignoring. There are some constants to all of them. Young men without work, and sometimes where the groups that they start hanging out with are stand-ins for family and actually become their family. There's a whole lot of interesting things that go on, but it is generally young men who start these mass movements, whether it's the apostles or ISIS. This motion and energy that grows around a burgeoning mass movement, it can be used for good or evil, and it is largely male. And we're seeing a very small version of that with these guys. And then there's Hargrave. He's an interesting one. And at the end of this chapter, he seems very insistent that Helen needs to know something, but it's something he knows will upset her, and evidently something that she may not find out otherwise. So he seems better than the rest most of the time, but then there are moments like this where I'm thinking, yeah, but dude, just let her have a moment. So, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to watch how this one plays out. But yeah, this was the big Aunt Irony chapter. And Esther Hargrave. We're getting a little bit more detail about Esther and her mother and how Millicent has pretty much been sold into a very odd, you can't say loveless now, just not adoring marriage. And poor Esther is getting to be that age too. So I think we'll see a little bit more about her shortly. But Esther's a cutie. So that's the positive place I'm leaving you today. Esther's a cutie. We're going to have more of her soon. All right. You take care of yourself. Wear a mask. Protect each other. Be well. I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye. If you like what you heard today, please leave a review over at iTunes. Join us on Facebook. Meet up with the knitters on Craftlet's Corner of Ravelry. Stay in the know on Instagram, or add your name to our mailing list, which I promise will never spam you. In fact, you probably want to buy a lottery ticket on any day that you get a message from the Craftlet mailing list, because that'll be a special day. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.